Hello, I am Supervisor Butarelli's devoted amanuensis, which I believe means someone who takes a lot of notes. And for once I get to read out somebody else's notes. Giovanni has asked me to say a few words to introduce our closing speaker today. Your physical stamina and intellectual effort are about to be rewarded with one of the most inspiring figures in the tech world. It's twilight now in Brussels, but it's morning in California. So it's time to connect to the West Coast. Jaron Lanier is a uniquely talented and provocative person. He's a technology pioneer, philosopher, musician. He's one of the few living reincarnations of a Renaissance man. Giovanni recalls with great fondness the conversations that he has had in person with Jaron over recent years. And Jaron is in here in spirit, if not in body. In fact, he embodies in many ways the spirit of the conference. And in a way, we're here because of Jaron. Not only was he a member of the Ethics Advisory Group, whose work Giovanni mentioned this morning, but it was reading Jaron's critical work, like on redressing the imbalances in the digital economy and society, which we have been hearing about this afternoon, that is partly responsible for giving Giovanni the vision to start to talk about ethics and to organize this conference. And for that, I'm sure all the staff of our small data protection authority will be forever grateful. So Jaron, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, and I wish I could be there in person. Thank you especially to Giovanni for his courage and leadership. I should mention in full disclosure that I do my research under the aegis of Microsoft, but in this case, I'm speaking as an individual, and the things I criticize include actions of Microsoft, so this is in no way a Microsoft point of view. So one concern I have is the overwhelming impression of complexity when people consider the problems of our day. And we hear this again and again, that it's hard to even quite agree on what the problems are. And when we consider solutions, we enter into this world of endless complexities. When the leadership of the companies address governments, they sometimes I would say, speak down to the government as if to say, only we can understand the complexity. You cannot. It's way beyond you. And uh, as a technologist, I feel it is my duty to find a way to make things simple. Because if I can't do that, I can't solve problems. Because none of us are intelligent enough to solve problems if we can't find a simple framing of the problem. That is exactly what problem solving is. And we certainly can't serve people if we believe that we're superior to people. We have to believe that we share an identity, that we share humanity with those whom we serve. So I believe there's a simple way to understand our problems, or at least I believe I found one. Maybe there are others, but I believe the very simple way to understand this is that the internet has the wrong business model right now, which is what we call the advertising business model. This was a terrible mistake. What happened was early on in the history of the internet, the people who started it, who included me, uh, worshipped essentially two ideals at the same time. One of those ideals was a sort of a socialist feeling that everything should be free, but the other one was a kind of a capitalist or libertarian ideal that we loved our tech entrepreneurs like our Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. And the only way to combine those two ideals into one thing was the advertising model, so that everything appears to be free, everything is shared, everything appears to be open, but actually there's this huge business in the background. And what that did is it created a system in which anytime two people connect online, it's always financed. by a third person who wants to manipulate the first two. And that notion that manipulation is baked in, is built in fundamentally, distorts and perverts the entire enterprise. Everything is screwed up. Now, when we look at trying to regulate that, we run into a very simple problem, which is that any attempt to regulate is directly opposed to the financial incentives that run the whole enterprise. And this cannot work. Society works when incentives and regulations are at least slightly aligned. They're never going to be perfectly aligned, or else there would be no need for regulations, but they can't be absolutely opposed. And on the internet, they are absolutely opposed. Regulations are trying to prevent manipulation, whereas the business plan can be about nothing but manipulation. So you have a direct, absolute opposition. Let me make a comparison. Let's suppose we were talking about cars, and instead of uh, starting the idea of cars with the business plan that somebody might purchase a car or rent a car, instead, what if cars were only provided for free, but with advertisers or some kind of manipulators paying the bill? For instance, you wouldn't have to pay for the car, but the car could only go to certain stores and not to other stores. This could happen in the era of self-driving cars. It's a possibility. Now, uh, what would happen in that case is the incentive for the manufacturer of cars would be to lower costs, while regulators would say, no, 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 you have to make them safe. And there would be a direct opposition. But in our system where people buy cars, the customer is somewhat aligned with the regulator because the customer wants the car to be safe. So you have this kind of connection. And indeed, because the customer wants the same thing as the regulator, the seller, the car manufacturer, has to be somewhat aligned with the customer. There's a kind of a consilience, a kind of a overlap between the interests of everybody in the system. It's not perfect overlap, but there it exists. Now, some might say, "Oh, but this is terrible. If you started to regulate in a way that might make cars more expensive in order to be safe, you'd be excluding poor people." But that would be ridiculous. It's better to have safe cars. And the way to address the questions of inequity is public transportation, cities that are safe for bicycles, many, many other things. And in the same way, this notion that if we make the internet safer and better, it would discriminate against the poor is an absolutely absurd idea. And yet, because we're so used to the current incentive structure, we have difficulty imagining any other way to think. Now, of course, there is another way to think about this, which is instead of selling manipulation services, the big internet companies could sell products and services, just like any normal business. And in that case, the user would be the customer. And in that case, the customer would have to be pleased. And in that case, there would be some kind of alignment between the interests of the customer and the company and the regulator. These would not be in total opposition. Uh, and this transition is absolutely possible. We've seen that you can take things that used to be free and start charging for them, and you can build businesses. For instance, Netflix is able to persuade people to pay for online video, even though online video is available for free, and they do it by packaging something that people want and are willing to pay for. Um, so this transition is demonstrably possible. But now I want to go over a few specific ways in which this one very simple idea actually covers a lot of territory and actually addresses a lot of the different problems that have been brought up today. Some of them are surprising. For instance, there was a complaint earlier about battery life, which is normally something I think of as being a sort of a consumer complaint rather than something about data. But actually, it is about data. And the reason why is that a lot of what is making the battery go down fast is not in the service of the user, but instead in the service of the thousands of advertising companies that are drawing data from every phone all the time. So, according to some studies, if the manipulation machine were shut down and people were only paying for the data that actually served their direct experience, what they wanted, as opposed to all of the spying and manipulation stuff, almost everyone could go down a tier in their data plan without noticing any decrease in their experience, but also their batteries would last much longer. Now, if you say how much, well, um, we estimate everyone in the United States is paying about $20 more a month than they should for their data just to pay for the manipulation network. Uh, Maybe I don't know. Would batteries last twice as long? I don't know, but some significant percentage of increased battery life would result. But then let's not even talk about that. Let's talk about the carbon footprint of the internet. The carbon footprint of the internet is somewhat disastrous for a number of reasons. It's vastly greater than it needs to be. A lot of it is stupid stuff. A lot of it is the manipulation business, which requires constant surveillance and manipulative messaging and preloading of manipulative videos and all this stuff, which is absolutely unnecessary, which nobody needs. Some of it is blockchain and other experiments. We have to start thinking about the carbon footprint of the internet. So that's another reason to reconsider the model. Now, another issue was brought up about the developing world and the role of phones in the developing world. I'd like to put forward a very simple hypothesis, which is that when simple phones arrived in rural areas, they empowered people. They gave people an ability to connect with each other, to understand where the best markets were, to understand all sorts of things, and they played a role in helping large numbers of people in rural Africa, in rural India, in other parts of the world to raise themselves out of poverty. We celebrate that. When the phones got better and they included services like Facebook, many of those same regions fell into ethnic and partisan bloodshed and divisiveness that had previously been on decline. Both things are true. I think this is an oversimplification, but basically, phones are good. The manipulation machine is bad. You can have phones without the manipulation machine. And the way to do it is to change the business model behind the phone. Um, it's an oversimplification, but I think it covers most of the truth. I want to bring up another issue, which I haven't heard discussed here, but which is related. One of the principal anxieties that people have about the future is whether there will still be employment because the same big tech companies that are grabbing all our data and manipulating us advertise, oh, we're building these artificial intelligences and these robots that will put you out of work. We see a lot of rhetoric of that kind, particularly from our friends at Google, I have to say. And just to be clear, I'm totally an insider. I love Google. I've sold Google a company, so I'm not. I really believe what we see is mostly well-intentioned, good people in the companies who have been trapped by their own stupid business plan into behaving in ways that are beneath them. But at any rate, an example I often use is language translators, such as those who might at this moment be translating what I say into other languages, despite the fact that I might be speaking too quickly. So my apologies. People in the translation business have seen their career prospects go down as automatic translators have appeared for things like business memos and little notes and what have you. I love automatic translation services. I think they're an improvement over what we had before. But here's the thing. We have broadcast this message that our artificial intelligence, our robots, are doing a job that people used to do. So those people simply have to accept that they no longer have jobs. And yet, we still need those people. Every single day, we, meaning companies like Google and Microsoft, steal tens of millions of example phrase translations from people all over the world who don't know that we're taking their data. We need them so that our translations can keep up with the changes to public events, slang, memes, all of these things. in order for the translations to still work on a daily basis, because language is alive. So on the one hand, we're telling people, hey, you're obsolete. On the other hand, oh, but we need you, but we'll only need you in the sense that we steal from you in secret. And so in this sense, data privacy is actually about the future of employment. In the future, as we have more services that might seem automated, in fact, that artificial intelligence style automation relies very heavily on data. And in fact, companies like Google often feel they have to grab all this data under the immediate motivation of the manipulation machine, but for the ultimate motivation of building giant AIs. So if we could just be honest that data comes from people, pay the people for their data in some kind of a market system, we could actually create new forms of employment, new forms of dignity. Instead of telling people, oh, now you're useless, now you'll have to live on some sort of basic income model. Now the only thing that matters is the tech company, and everybody else is just kind of a dependent or something. Instead of saying that, we could say, hey, we recognize you're valuable in new ways. And by the way, if you're thinking to yourself, well, only a few intellectuals would be valuable, not most people in the world, please reconsider that. Please ask yourself if you're being a sort of an elitist about that. I have a very strong suspicion that a lot of people in the world, especially in the developing world, will turn out to be valuable in a world in which data is actually acknowledged and valued. Maybe I'm wrong. There's only one way to find out. But let us not presume that people are less valuable than they might be. I think that's an unethical presumption. Let me put it that way. So where does that leave us? The expected or normative future at this point is one in which the tech companies continue to exist approximately in the way that they do, and then other forces try to counterbalance them with regulation or maybe some sort of public pressure. That's very difficult, and the reason why is that since the nature of the new power concentration actually ruins public dialogue and damages the public conversation, using the public conversation to check it is inherently difficult. We already have these companies creating waves of cranky political results, which happen to probably be in their benefit. So there's a danger of a cycle of self-reinforcing political degradation. I think the right way to fix this is not so much to attack the companies, but to point out to the companies that what they're doing isn't even in their own interest, and to try to get them to reform based on rationality and common sense. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you look at the giant tech companies, let's say there's 5 big ones, there's only 2 that have utterly failed to diversify their profit centers. So that's Google and Facebook. They can diversify their cost centers. Google has all kinds of crazy businesses, but they're essentially dependent on the manipulation machine, or what they call the advertising model, very much in the way that a petrostate becomes dependent on oil and finds it very difficult to diversify. And when you become addicted to your own drug, to your own bizarre monopolistic product, everything becomes distorted and you destroy your own future. You destroy your own diversification. You become rigid. And this is exactly what Google and Facebook are doing to themselves. So it's absolutely in the interest of Google and Facebook employees and in their shareholders to change this business model. In fact, changing the business model is the one thing, as hard as it might be to do, that actually serves the interests of everybody in the loop, so far as I can tell. This might sound like a radical idea, but it is the simplest idea, and it is sensible. So I'd ask you to consider agitating for this change, and it'll make all the other changes we've talked about accessible and clearer. Well, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy your gala dinner. I certainly wish I could be there with you. Thank you again, Giovanni, for having me, and to all of you.